All right, can everyone see the slides? Perfect. Yes, welcome to week one of the web design decal. I see we have about like 70 people here, or 80 now. So that's pretty good out of a class of 120. Thanks for showing up. And yeah, let's get started. So today, a few quick announcements before we get started. If you haven't already, be sure to create your portal account by tonight because we'll be assigning homework. If you haven't already, please join the Piazza, which is our forum for Q&A. You can also ask questions anonymously, so people tend to like that. And last but not least, be sure to enroll in CS 198 on Cal Central using the permission number that your TA emailed you a week ago, I think. So as I said earlier, homework one will be officially released on Piazza. There'll be a post on Piazza telling you that homework one is released, and then you can download the actual starter files off of the portal. If you have any questions for this lecture, feel free to use the queue, which is at this link right here. And if you'd prefer to just scream it out loud on the Zoom chat, that's totally fine as well. Last but not least, be sure to download VS Code as well as Chrome, which we covered last class if you haven't already done that. And if you need any DSP accommodations, please email us as soon as possible so that we can help figure out how to make the class easier for you. All right, so let's get started. So throughout this entire semester, you're going to be hearing about a lot of different creative tools. Here are some of the big names that you've probably heard of already by now. A couple of the ones we'll be working with specifically are Chrome for the web browser, VS Code for the code editor, which you got a quick introduction to last time, as well as Figma for prototyping, which we'll be using in a couple weeks from now. So don't worry about any of these names if you don't know them, but just to give you a quick overview of all the different names of applications you might hear throughout the semester. Now, what are we going to be discussing today? So there's really 5 different topics. The first of which is the structure of websites, and then the structure of a single web page, and then the content of the web page, along with the HTML tags and file paths. So that might seem like a lot. So let's just get started with the first one, which is the structure of websites. So the first question you're probably asking is, what is a website? Well, traditionally, it's a set of web pages that's served over a single domain. This is like the home page, the about page, the contact page, all the pages that you would see on a typical website. And for the simplest of web pages, they're usually written in HTML. Now, when you go to a website, you probably type in a domain, for example, wdd.io, which represents where the files are located. So what does this mean? Well, when we take a look at the fire station in Berkeley, we just call it the fire station. But really what we're doing when we say this word fire station is we're looking up the address, which is 2680 Shattuck. In a similar way, we also do that when we're looking up the address to go to a web page. So wdd.io will send a request to a DNS server, which resolves into this big long line of numbers. And basically they're just the same thing, except that when I tried typing this in, it didn't work because our IP must have changed, but that's a different story. Basically all you need to know is, when you type in a domain, it resolves to a bunch of numbers, which serves up whatever you see. Now, this isn't a big thing you need to know, but just some background information because people tend to ask. Now, what exactly comes back when you, send a request to a server? Well, all this and then some. It might look like a lot of code, but all of the stuff you see up here right now is actually code that doesn't show up on the web page. The only thing you might notice is this title, which we'll get into how exactly this works. But essentially, this is just what you see on the little tab when you open up any like tab on Chrome, something or anything like that. Ultimately, all that code renders like this onto the HTML canvas, which we will cover in depth throughout the course of the semester. Now, how is a website like made up? So typically, roughly speaking, there's basically 2 parts to it, which is the front end, which is what we're going to be building in this class, and the back end, which is where the business logic, the databases, and all the processing comes in when it comes to data. Now, what the front end is what the user can see. So for example, when you go to wdd.io and you see the whole interface, that is what you'll be building in class, which is the front end. Websites are typically made up of they are made up of three parts. The HTML, which stands for Hypertext Markup Language, being the structure of the site. Now that provides basically like the skeleton, and then the CSS is the design, which makes it look nice, and then the JavaScript lets us, it adds functionality to the website. So things like buttons, forms, things like that, that really make a site stand out and work. So as I mentioned, HTML provides a structure, and it stands for a hypertext markup language, and it defines like the content, the text, the links, the images, basically everything you see on the page. Now, it looks something like this. This would be what the HTML looks like. I know it's a lot, but don't worry, we'll be covering what every line of this means in a little bit. And then CSS, this is basically what CSS looks like. This is each line of CSS is styling a specific element within the HTML, which we'll actually be getting into next week. And finally, JavaScript, as I mentioned, provides the function of the page. So things like a drop-down menu where you click and then it expands to show a bunch of different options. That is, what I guess a basic use case of JavaScript. And it looks something like this. Now, this is jQuery, which we're not going to be using this semester, but syntactically it's a little different. But overall, the logic is still there. Now, when you go into a website, it's typically made up of a bunch of files, which looks something like this. Near the end of the lecture, we'll get into exactly how you can structure your own project. But just a quick overview, these are all CSS files that end in .css, and then the JavaScript ends in .js, and then the images here actually end in PNG, but they can also end in other extensions like GIFs, which .gif, as well as JPEGs, which can typically, actually it depends. It could either end in JPEG or JPG. And then, as you can see, the actual HTML is in all the pages that end in .html, which are styled by the CSS, which pull images onto the pages from the images. Now, let's actually get into the structure of the website itself. This is where we get into the HTML, where, as I mentioned, this is the structure of what we're going to be building. So our starting point for the website is what we call the index.html file. Now, when you visit any site, the first place you'll be redirected to is the index file. This is critical, and be sure to remember this because when you work on your homework, you're going to want to make sure that the file you're working on is named index.html, because if you don't have one in your folder, then you will have some issues when we come to grade your homework. Okay. Yeah, so within the index.html file, we also have what are tags, which are a collection of parent-child relationships. We'll get into what exactly that means, but essentially, you can think of it as, I don't exactly know what these dolls are called, but they're basically stacking dolls where one goes in the other, and that's sort of the whole pattern of using HTML. Now, this is a basic tag. This one's called the strong tag, which basically makes it bold. We'll get into some more of these later, but just as an example, almost every tag is written in this sort of format, with one opening tag like this, and then a closing tag. Notice the backslash right here, or is that I think that's a forward slash. The forward slash right here, which closes it, so that the browser knows that everything inside of the two tags is the content that we want to display. Typically, they come in pairs, but there are certain exceptions, such as image tags, which we'll be covering in a little bit. Now, if we take a look at a simple website right here, this is an HTML document that makes this, well, it basically creates what we see here on the right on the Mac render. But let's go line by line and take a look at what each means. So the first line of every HTML file uses this doctype HTML line. This tells the browser that everything in this file is HTML, and while you probably would be able to render it on most modern browsers without this line, it is pretty important for accessibility reasons to always include it in every HTML file. Now, the second thing you see is two HTML tags, which tells the browser that everything inside of here is HTML code. You notice here, just like we saw in the previous slide, we have an opening tag and a closing tag, and then everything inside this HTML tag, these HTML tags are the content of the HTML tags. And then we see two main elements, similar to how we talked about the stacking doll example. These items, being the head and the body, are inside of the HTML. So the head contains things that you typically don't see rendered on a page. So for example, the title, that's, as I mentioned, the name of the tab that you see. So if you have multiple tabs open, you'll see like a name. For example, I think for our portal, it's called like web design decal or something super general like that. But this is also the location where we link our CSS files and JavaScript files. If you don't know what that means, that's fine. We'll discuss that next week. And then, okay, yeah, as I mentioned, there's also the title tag, which specifies the tab name, and then the body, which is what we actually see on the page. So the body is basically everything you see here on the right here. So the welcome to WDD, the image, everything there is inside the body. There should be a slide talking about, oh, here we are. All right. So the first thing we see inside the body is the P tag. We'll talk about what that means, but that's basically the text containing welcome to WDD. You see that right there. And remember, we always need a opening and closing tag, and then everything inside is what we see. In terms of the image tag, this one is a little different because it doesn't actually have a closing tag, but notice that the image has an attribute here. This it's like brownish color right here for the source src is what's known as the attribute. Now, we also have this wdd.png, but what does that mean? Well, the wdd.png is the name of the file or the image that we have within our folder, within our directory. So this source tag is basically telling the browser, okay, display an image that is called wdd.png. It pulls that in and puts it onto the page. Now, the image tag is one of the few exceptions to the opening and closing rule. You see, we still have the backslash right here, or forward slash right here, but we don't need another closing and opening tag because that's just how it works. If you ever are confused by the syntax, don't worry. I mess it up all the time, and there's honestly way too much to remember. So Google is your best friend when it comes to something like that. Now, one thing to mention here is that this grayed out area is what is called a comment. Basically, this area, everything inside these two basically arrows are not shown on the page. But why do we use them? Well, when we go back and maintain the site, having comments to tell us what each item or what each element does, not every element, but what each like container does, it makes it really helpful for not only ourselves to maintain the site, but also if someone else wants to come in, they don't have to read through every single line in order to know what is being displayed. So before we keep going, are there any questions? Okay, I don't think so. All right then. Let's keep going then. So the next thing we're going to discuss are basic HTML tags, which are essentially what we've been seeing, but we'll go a little bit more in depth into it. So there's a bunch of different HTML tags that exist. Some of the more popular ones that you'll probably be using include the paragraph tag, which is the one with the P that we saw earlier. We can also modify that to include bold and italics. And we also have things like headings, links, lists, and images, which are elements that you see all the time, even if you may not realize it. So to start off, the paragraph tag, as we saw earlier, it has the opening and closing P tag. This is typically used on, well, paragraphs. So like any text that's not the title is typically where we use it. Again, it starts with a P, and this is just your normal average text. Now we can modify that a bit by using these two bold and italic, well, what are they called, tags. The bold one is known as strong. You can also use B. It really achieves the same effect. But as you can see on the right, if we put text inside the strong tag, it turns bold. And if we use the EM, EM tags put it around the text. Italic text, you see on the right, it creates italicized text. It's technically called emphasized, but no one really calls it that. But it's don't wait. I think actually no, you cannot use I, so be careful not to do that. Italicized text is EM. Now we can also nest tags inside in the same way that we saw earlier with the body and head inside the HTML. So just like the nesting doll idea, you can put EM tags, which are the italics, inside of the strong tags, which end up creating what we see here in the different text, where because different is inside the opening and closing EM tags, that makes it italic. And then everything here, including the tags as well as the word text, is inside the two strong tags, which makes the entire different text line bold as well. Oh, you also might notice that we're missing a tag here. Sorry about that. We can get that fixed for you. We're missing a closing bracket right there. What did I just do? Yeah, right here on the closing tag, but we will get that fixed for you. In terms of headings, these are basically pretty self-explanatory. It's the big text that you see all over the page. So for example, when you first notice that when you first visit a page, you see a giant text on the screen. That is typically an H1 tag. But by convention, typically you only use one H1 tag per page. That is like the big title. That's mostly because search engines and for search engines accessibility reasons, if you were to use multiple on a page, it would still show up. But for best practices, we tend to stay away from using multiple headings. Now, something that's really important are links. We use links everywhere on web pages. Anytime you click to visit another page, whether it be another page within our same website or going to another page. Like if we go on Twitter, we can click. Every one of those tweets are a link itself. So when you click on it, you go to another page. And if you click on a link that's linked inside that's kind of hard to explain, but if there's a link inside a tweet where you have like, I don't know, google.com, and you click on that, that's also a link. Now notice we use what are called anchor tags. So they're not called link tags. And then as part of the anchor tag, we have an attribute known as the href, which contains a URL. In this case, we're just using example.com. And one thing to be sure of is when you're using an href that you want to redirect to another page, so not a page within the same website, you always want to have either an http:// or https://. Otherwise, your browser will think it's the same page, and I won't go into what happens, but if you want to experiment on your own time, it's like 2 seconds. You'll see exactly why this won't work if we leave out this HTTPS portion. And then also click here. This is what we actually see when we click. So we click here and it'll send us to example.com. Now, something else that is pretty often used, you may not notice it because typically it's styled in a different way than what you see here on the right, but they are lists. So there's a number of different lists you can use. There's ordered lists, which would be OL, unordered, which is UL. For our purposes here, we're using an unordered list. So we we create a parent element, which is the UL tags, and inside we create list elements, each of which contain text. So the LI tags each contain apple, oranges, and bananas, which show up on this right side over here with the bullet points as each one. And the UL tag, you don't actually see the UL tag, but it is what surrounds the entire group of lists. Another thing that we commonly use are images. Now, images, as I mentioned earlier, images are one of the exceptions where we don't use opening and closing tags, simply because if we were to have an image, it wouldn't really make sense for us to put text inside or nest anything inside of an image, because all we want to do is show the picture that we're linking. Now, the image contains what's called a source attribute, which is the file path. We'll get into exactly what this means, but you basically link the file path. This is what's known as a relative file path, which goes from your current folder into the folder called folder in this case, and then into the apple.jpg to grab that link, to grab that image. Now we can also use images from other websites. So assuming we weren't on wd.io and we wanted to link an image of Asia for some reason, we would go and use this external tag. And just like how in the link tag or the anchor tags, we appended the HTTPS, we do this because it's an external URL and it's not part of the site we're on right now. Another nesting example, we can actually link or put an image inside of a link. And in this case, because the image is inside, it's nested inside, if we click on the image, it'll actually redirect us to the wd.io link, which is within the href attribute of the anchor tag. Oh, well, okay. I forgot I was supposed to ask. All right, never mind. Any questions though, before we go to our, I think we have one more topic. Feel free to use the raise hand button on the participants thing, or just you can unmute yourself if you'd like.
Could you go over the last slide again?
Yeah, this one?
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, so basically what we're doing here is nesting the image inside of the link, which is, or the anchor tag. This allows us to basically make it so that we could click on the image that shows up and it'll send us to this link. So just like how, where is it? Let me find the, oh, hold on. Let me find the other slide for you. Here, yeah. So just like how we have it here, it's basically the same setup, except that instead of putting click here inside the anchor tag, we're actually using an image. So that instead of clicking on the click here text, we're clicking on the image to go to this URL within the href attribute. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Anyone else? Okay, let's keep going then. So we seem to be pretty, okay, hold on. You seem to be pretty specific when it comes to tags, but what about like the generic tag? How do we structure the content? Now, before we actually answer that question, let's see if you guys can spot some tags. So go ahead and throw it out in the chat, what you can see, what types of tags you see in this code right here on the left. Yeah, good. Yeah. So I'm seeing people are mentioning the head tag, the body tag, H1 paragraph tag right here, the empty head, as well as the HTML. Yeah, great job, great job. So that's exactly what we're talking about. But you notice there's something funny here, which we didn't cover yet. It's called the div. Now, what exactly is a div? It's not something that would actually show up on a page. So if we were to just put in something like, say, I don't know, an empty div, we wouldn't actually see it. Oh, sorry. We wouldn't actually see it on the page. But basically what it helps us to do is structure our content. You'll see how it's more useful next week. But for now, you probably won't need to use it this week, but next week we'll see how basically divs help us break up the page so that if we want, say, 2 columns on the page, we can use a div for each column and then style it so that they sit side by side. That's a pretty general overview, but as we get going, we'll start noticing why they're so helpful. So just a summary of HTML. Some tags are useful for like formatting, things like EM, H1, things like that. H1 through H6 actually is, okay, let me pull back. There's actually 6 H1 or H tags, header tags, H1, H2, H3, all the way down to H6. Each one is progressively smaller in terms of font size. And those tags, including EM tags and header tags, all come with visual formatting by the browser. So if we just did a default H1 tag, it would look different on Chrome than it would on, say, Edge or Firefox or Safari. but we'll get into how we can change that ourselves next week. HTML is not for visual formatting, as I mentioned earlier. It's the skeleton of the code. There's the skeleton of the page, and how we make it look nice is using CSS, which we will cover next week, actually. And then last but not least, I mentioned we will talk about file paths. This is actually something that a lot of people mess up on, and we get a ton of office hours questions about this. So we just wanted to make sure that everyone is comfortable with these. So as I mentioned with the image, we use what's called a source attribute and then put the file path inside. So if I were using Windows, we would have, if we wanted to just grab the absolute path, which basically means we're starting from all the way from our users folder, we could use this file path. It's definitely valid, but once we submit it on the portal, it won't work. Why? Because this file path is telling us to go onto Heidi's computer, go into her Heidi user, and then opening her pictures folder, and then grabbing the image. But once we actually get to the server, we cannot access your computer. So you want to make sure that your file paths are correct and actually work. So for example, we have a examples file structure with the homework 1 structure that you'll be working with for the homework that we released. I think we released it, that we released earlier today. So you have an overall folder called homework 1, which contains your index file as well as an images folder that contains two photos of dogs. Now, if we wanted to actually link say the first dog, the doggo, on the index within our HTML, what we would have to do is use a relative file path. So if we're starting here on the index, basically what we'd have to do is go into the images folder and then go down and grab this dog image, which is exactly what we see here on the source. Now, say we had another file inside images, we would have to basically, well, actually, I think that's a little bit out of scope, but we would have to preface it using a // to go out of the folder and then come back up. But I wouldn't worry too much about that until a little later. But just remember, if you're using images, always use a relative file path, well, otherwise it may not show up when you turn it in. Oh yeah, one other thing, our web server is case sensitive, so be sure that your source URLs are correctly capitalized. Does someone have a question? No? Okay. So yeah, just a quick summary. Be sure to indent your lines so they can easily see where your opening and closing tags are. VS Code does a good job of helping you out with that, but sometimes it does mess up from time to time. So make sure to align your each line properly so that you know what's inside what when you need to go and debug. Another tip is to refresh your browser often. So after every line of HTML that you write, we'd recommend opening up the index.html in a browser, whether that be Chrome or Firefox or Safari, and then refreshing after every change to make sure that everything you're doing is showing up. And then last but not least, if it doesn't look the way you expect, double check your opening and closing tags as well as spelling, whether that be the file path or just misspelling something that you didn't expect to do. For example, if you had a P tag, check that you didn't accidentally type O. Or if you're typing div, make sure you didn't accidentally type DUV or something like that. And then as always, if you are confused or forgot how one of the tags works, you can always reference this PowerPoint as well as other online resources as well. Google, again, is your best friend when it comes to all the new and confusing syntaxes that you'll come across. So for your homework, again, it has been released and it will be due next Tuesday at 7 p.m. on the portal. Be sure to create your portal account if you haven't already done so, so that you can access the files and turn in your assignment. It'll cover what we've done today, as well as I think a little bit of what Asia will be going over afterwards. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask on Piazza. And we will cover this if we have time at the end. Awesome. So I think Asia's gonna go. Do we have time for a break, or do we want to just keep going?
We could give a break, like
All right.
3 minutes. You wanna Spotify us or Asia if you are sharing?
Sure, yeah, give me a second. Okay. Just a quick reminder that if you want to ask questions when we're not in the questions period, you can post your questions in the queue that's in the portal. So yeah, let's get started. This week, we're basically covering a super basic introduction to design. So yeah, there you go. So what is design? So design is not purely aesthetics. It's not art. That's what, I mean, if you're interested in having an intellectual conversation about that, you can come to my office hours. But basically, it's not just about making things look pretty. That's only the surface level thing that you do for design. Basically, design is about problem solving. This is a really good diagram that shows all of the things that you need to consider in design. So it's basically coming up with a solution that's actually effective and worthwhile based on all the constraints and all the possible considerations you need to make in order to make it optimal and effective. So what users need, what the company needs, what our habits are. It's just incredibly complicated and awesome. And yeah, we'll get into it more. So yeah, you've probably heard of all of these, different buzzwords and stuff. But so user interface design, graphic design, physical product design, visual design, etc. And they're all very interconnected, and we'll get into more of them as we go through the class. But the three that we'll be focusing on the most throughout the class are these three: user interface design, user experience design, also known as UI UX, and human-centered design, which is new this semester, kind of. So user interface design and user interface is the space where interactions between humans and machines occur. So when you design user interfaces, this doesn't have to be a website or a screen, even though that's what we're focusing on. Like if you think about it, the user interface between the TV and you might be the screen of the TV, but it's also the remote that you use. So just in general, how you interact with technology. User experience, or UX, is a person's emotions and attitude about using a product, system, or service. And usually we want to make sure that people have an enjoyable experience, not just so that they return to the product and keep paying for it, but we want to make sure that our designs actually make an impact and are helpful to people, and that we're innovating and just helping people out genuinely. And then human-centered design, or HCD, is a design approach that incorporates the human perspective or what works best for humans. And we'll cover the human-centered design process much later in the course, probably towards the end. But basically it differs from user experience because the user of technology might not be a human. So it could be something that a dog uses, or like the dog car seat belts or whatever. Human-centered design is about designing stuff particularly for humans, and making sure that we keep in mind how humans work, what's best for humans, what our habits are, etc., and what we need. So in general, design is form meet function. So something beautiful and enjoyable and pleasant to work with, but also extremely functional and practical and effective. So this is kind of a collage of things that we hear from people throughout the class and in office hours. I just can't see it. I don't know how to do visual design. I don't know how to do aesthetic. I don't have the eye for visuals. And I don't know if this is allowed, but I'm gonna swear that's kind of bullshit, in my opinion. I feel this way all the time, even coming from an art and graphic design background, but it's easy to overcome. And I personally believe that anybody can have an eye for visual design if they really want to. So here are some tips, I guess, to overcoming feeling like this. So first of all, surround yourself with inspiration. Follow designers and artists and other super talented people on social media. Just in general, explore. And just try to save these things that inspire you so you can look back on it anytime that you're stuck. So like take pictures, have a folder on your computer. I have multiple, I don't know if you can see my like top bar of my browser, but I have like a thing of bookmarks of just really well-designed things. And yeah, so be inspired by stuff, and it can come from anywhere. Second of all, try not to compare yourself with others. When you look at all this inspiration and great work, you develop a great taste for things, but a lot of the people who are making these really great stuff have a team, tons of experience, tons of resources. Like, it's fine if you're not up to that, or you will be up to that eventually in the future if you keep practicing and working on it. So just remember to look back on your own progress, and like, you're doing your own thing. It doesn't have to be what other people are doing. And I guess the last thing, or my last tip for this, is to just practice as much as you can. So recreate things that you like, but don't submit it for your portfolio or anything like that, because that's plagiarism. But recreating like the Apple website or Discord or something that's super well designed will help you understand how they make it and how it works and why it looks good. So yeah, just make things on your own, experiment with the tools, and they don't have to be particularly meaningful. Like, it can be a pretend website for a fictional storekeeper or something. I don't know. Like, just figure out what works for you and what doesn't, and you'll eventually get a feel for it with practice. That was a really long ramble about that, but yeah. So now we're going to get into prototyping and fidelities. So low to mid fidelity, I would say the ones in this graphic are more towards mid fidelity. Is basically figuring out the structure of your site, and you want to go through a process when designing it. You don't want to just jump into the final thing, because you need to have the intention and the functionality locked down before you can get into the aesthetics of it. So at low and mid fidelity, you plan what content is going to be there, where it's going to be, what the experience is on a basic level, and things like that I mentioned. We'll get into it more when we actually get into going through those steps, but low and mid fidelity is basically the design intent of the final product. And then high fidelity is making it actually look like how it's going to appear in the final thing. So a high fidelity prototype, as you can tell, it has all the colors and images in, and it shows what every part of it is going to look like in the final form. And then interactive prototypes, which hopefully we'll cover some of, is basically, it's not coded at all, but it uses the high fidelity prototypes to simulate what it actually will be like to navigate the website or thing that you're designing. So now we're going to put everything together. So a wireframe, the mockup, and the HTML. So this is an example. On the left, you have a really rough wireframe, which is equivalent to a low fidelity prototype. And on the right, you have a high fidelity prototype of some card from Groupon or something that sells experiences. This happens to be chilling with the cheesemonger. And at the bottom, we have the HTML for this simple card, and I'll go through it bit by bit so you can see how the design transfers to HTML. So you want to encompass the whole card as one thing together. So you have the outermost div that's highlighted in green right now in the bottom here. And that's your overall container that will contain the whole card. And then you have the image that you want to take up most of this card, and it comes first. So then you have the div with the image in it. And then after that, we have this box for where we want the text to go. So then you would make another div for where the price and the title would go. And then you have this final thing on the bottom for the reviews and for the stars. So then you have another div for that. Though probably the stars and the reviews will be two separate things within the div. But those are just the general boxes for where parts of the website are going to go. So you can draw the squares and boxes of how your HTML is going to be broken down in your wireframes, and that's something you should consider as you design it. How is it going to be coded? How do you want it to be organized? And yeah, and use that as a guide for how you're going to code and how you're going to design what you're making. I'm sorry, I've been talking a lot today. So here's some creative tools. I think Nick covered some of them before. PowerPoint and Illustrator and Photoshop are not what you should use to prototype things, but we are going to be covering Figma, but not Adobe XD or Keynote, although those also work. But to make the low fidelity prototypes, you don't need any of this fancy software, and you can actually just do it on pen and paper. And I recommend just marking up the page as much as you want. I know the earlier one, let me go back to it. This one looks very clean and it just has where the content is, but I preferred to make notes about where I'm gonna put the colors, how I want things to move if things are going to move. Those are all things that you want to consider. Just take notes as much as you can throughout the design process is my suggestion. Yeah, let me go back to where it was. So yeah, I guess a brief encouragement interlude, oops. As I kind of mentioned earlier with comparing yourself, this is a lot of information to be, I don't know, dumped on you right now. And that's totally okay. I know it's kind of overwhelming, and kind of all designers have to struggle with imposter syndrome because we see so much great work all the time. And yeah, it's okay. As I said, everyone's doing their own thing. Make it yours, make it unique. And as long as you are trying your best, you keep learning and you keep exploring, it'll be great. Just have a good time. It's basically my advice. So yeah, if you're seriously interested in design as a career, well, our last lecture will be about that, but also feel free to reach out to me in office hours or any of the other instructors actually, and staff, and just ask us questions about design careers, how you prep for it, etc. I'd be really happy to answer any of them. So yeah, that was fundamentals. And then the next couple of weeks will be about UI design and visuals. And then after that, it's kind of exploration, impact, and strategy of design. Does anybody have questions? Let me look at the chat. I see there's a question about accessibility. So I would say it's kind of both in UX and human-centered, even though Emily answered this in a really great way. Yeah, but I plan on having a whole lecture about accessibility and inclusivity and kind of last week of exploration. How do we check in for a lecture? You don't need to do that, but cool, we're not taking attendance. And what program generated those low and mid fidelity windows? So I actually got those from the internet, but if you want to make low to mid fidelity ones like that, you can use Figma or Adobe XD. And you don't have to make it with the X or anything, but that's just something some designers choose to do. But you can kind of denote things however you want to, as long as it's clear. Yeah, are there any other questions? Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask before we move on to the VS Code thing. Okay, I don't think there's any questions. So yeah, Nick, go ahead.
Actually, I'll be taking over for this part.
Oh, JK.
It's going to be pretty simple. I'm just going to show you guys how homework is structured and how you use VS Code in the first place, just so that you guys can get started. And we'll also be going over more detail of this in lab on Thursday too. So let me just share. Cool. So here you see, let me just log into my student portal. So this is your guys' view on the portal. As you can see, homework 1 is already released. And then the slides we just had for today are here for week 1. So all you have to do is just click on view assignment, boom. And now this is the page for basically the homework instructions. So I highly recommend you read through all of it. There are good links here, and follow it step by step, and you'll basically do the homework. And at the bottom here, they'll tell you instructions on how to submit. Basically, you'll be zipping a file and submitting through the portal. If you saw like here, you have the submit button, and that's where you submit that file. And we'll also be going into detail of how to zip that file itself, or the relevant files for the homework. So this is basically the homework instructions, and that's how you access them. Normally for other homeworks, like there are starter codes that we give, and you'll see like this big green button somewhere on the instructions where it's like download, and you'll download all the files that are relevant. So we can give you the skeleton code so you're not like starting the homework from scratch. But at least for this one, since we're talking about basics, we want you to just create like your own HTML file, which I'll be going over now. If I can figure out how to move this bar. Okay, let me just VS Code. So now we open up VS Code. Oops. Okay, sure. Yeah. All right. So this is basically VS Code, and I guess this is one of our homeworks in HTML. So what you just saw on the screen, and that's the HTML version. But for the homework, you're going to be making your own index.html file. So what you do is, yeah, please ignore my games. This is my gaming PC. My personal laptop's in repair. So you go to new file. Yeah, this is Windows, but for this whole purpose, I think it's the same thing on Macs. So you do new file, and I just like to immediately save it just because like gives me good reference. So again, like Nick mentioned, your first HTML file should be called index.html, or else it's going to have issues when you submit. So now this file recognizes it as an HTML file. So we can just start coding like, oh, like doctype. Oh, like VS Code already knows, like, I'm going to start with doctype. I don't even have to type the whole thing. And then the cool thing about VS Code is like, if I wanted a whole tag, like and it has like the opening and closing one, it's kind of hassle to type like angular brackets HTML / HTML as a closing tag. So if you type HTML and you press enter, it'll give you both, and you could already type in both of them. And same thing like head, type both, boom. Yeah, and then like body, I'm just gonna put like an H1 tag, like whatever. So basically to save, you have to save it, Control S or Command S on the Mac. And then how you open it is now you go to folders, wherever you save that. You see this index.html, all you need to do is just double click that. Boom, now you see your stuff. And like once you make changes, all you gotta do is just refresh the page. You don't have to reopen. Like, oh sorry, I need to save the file. And then boom, you see the changes already being made. So that's basically how you make the index.html file. And like for later homeworks, when you download the starter codes, all you need to do is just open folder here, and then choose whatever folder you need to get based on your download, and it'll open the folder with those relevant files for you. Cool. Yeah, and just make sure that your index.html file is in the folder or in your zip file, or else like then there's really no point in, like, you just basically did your homework for nothing. So yeah, and that's basically it. Are there any questions so far?
I have a quick question.
Yeah, what's up?
How would you rename your file on the page that you're on right now? Because I've been trying to like double click or.
Like rename the file?
Oh,
like
you just go on file, right? Yeah, there's no rename there.
What I just do, I probably just go to the folder and then just press rename.
Okay.
And then do whatever.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions so far?
Sorry, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
What did you say to not do so that you wouldn't have done your work for nothing?
Oh, what did I say to not do?
Yeah.
Yeah, so make sure when you're zipping, you include your index.html file in the zip. It tells you in detail here on the submission part of the homework.
Okay.
So like these, at least for the homework, this is the stuff that should be in your zip, or else things are gonna break.
The show.
Yeah. Wait, Nick, what do you mean by open folder? I already went through that.
If you hit open folder and then select the homework 1 folder, or the archive, whatever it's called.
Yeah, I don't have that. Well, actually, let me just.
Didn't you just download the?
So, at least, okay, so for.
Click select open and then.
Where'd it go? What the heck? What? Okay, so I don't know where is that? Okay, so at least for Mac, when you download your files, it's going to be a zip file. So you're going to, I'm not Mac, Windows, it's going to be a zip file, and you're going to have to extract it before you work on it. There has been issues with some Windows users, like you can edit code in the zip file before you extract, but submitting was just such a pain. So always extract your files. Mac does this automatically, so you don't have to worry about that. So all you got to do is now, I can find that. Oh, here it is. So we have homework 1 here. I just select folder. That's okay, don't save. And now we see that we open this folder and it has the index.html file. This is just our instructions HTML. And you can see our folders here. Don't worry about this. This is CSS. Don't be scared. We'll cover that next week. And yeah, so you just have your whole folder here. That's how you basically open it. Oh, and here's rename. So F2, you can rename your files here. Yeah, any questions about that?
Yeah, on Windows, how did you make the index.html? How did you start that file?
How did I create it?
Yeah, because there's no Chrome text.
Yeah, so if you go to the top bar on Windows called File, and then there's a option called New File or Control N shortcut, it'll take you to a new file, and then you could save it as whatever you want it to be
I
called.
got you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Let me see. Is there an option to resubmit? Yes, there is an option to resubmit. So on the portal here, what you'll see after you press submit is an option to resubmit. So change your files, your code locally, re-zip it, and then press the resubmit button, and you'll be able to see it again. Yeah. So here at the bottom, you see like this bar. It already says homework 1. It's all grayed out because I haven't submitted anything. But once you submit, this view button will like ungray itself, and you'll be able to view your submission. And I'll highly recommend you double check this view to make sure it looks exactly like what it is in your local. Because if you are still confused with like some things like file paths for images, it might show up on your personal computer, but when you submit it, it's not going to show up. And it's and if you don't double check that, we're just going to grade it as is, and you're going to get points docked off for that. So please double check your web submission version rather than your local. Are there any other questions? When coding our paragraph in the homework, someone answer that. Yeah, Nick just answered that. You could wrap it. You could also press enter, like start a new line, and it would do the same thing. It wouldn't add like a new space or a new line, and it would look the same. So that's what I do, but whatever works for you. Yeah, any other questions? Cool. If you have other questions lingering, you can always stay and chat with us. But other than that, you are free to go. Thank you for coming out. We'll see you guys on Thursday. Oh yeah, again, Thursday we'll show you how to submit or zip and submit on portal if you need more details. And we'll release a lab that day too. So yeah, see you Thursday. Bye-bye.